Hi, pet owners, and welcome back to the Small Dogs, Small Bytes podcast. This is episode 3. Today, I want to talk a bit about dog parks because I have a lot of clients of all sizes asking me, what do I do? Do I take my dog to the dog park? Do I not take my dog to the dog park? Are dog parks bad? Are they safe? Are they good? Well, we'll discuss that here. Now, the first thing you need to consider is the size of your dog. So if you have a smaller breed of dog, you want to make sure you're taking your dog to a park that is appropriate to their size. So if you have a small breed, make sure that your dog park has a small breed and a large breed section. And if anyone happens to bring a large breed into the small breed section, make sure you take your dog out. Now, the problem with dog parks and letting large breeds and small breeds play together is that dog parks usually have a pretty wide expanse of space. And when dogs, when they get moving, they can put on some serious speed, and it can really injure another dog if they barrel right into them. And dogs love to barrel right into each other. All dogs do. I don't know why. They like to take your knees out too, so be careful if you're in the dog park too. Now, if you have a smaller breed of dog, this could actually seriously injure your dog. And then dog fights between large breeds and small breeds, obviously a larger breed has more muscle mass to them, so they can do a little bit more damage to your dog. So you do want to make sure that you're separating your large breeds and your small breeds in dog parks. If you don't have the option to choose a small breed specific dog park, you want to make sure that there aren't any large breeds in the park while you're there. And then the other consideration too that you want to make here is the number of dogs in the park at that time. So if you're at the park and more people keep showing up and more people keep showing up, you're probably going to want to take your dog out once you hit a capacity of about, I would say, 6 to 7 dogs. Now, as you increase the number of dogs you have playing in a dog park, you have more variables, more dogs who could potentially cause an issue for your dog or could potentially start fighting, and your dog could get involved and your dog could get injured. When you take your dog to a dog park, there's always some level of risk involved. So your dog does have a good level of benefit too. They get that opportunity to socialize and run and play, and especially for people who don't have fenced yards or areas to let their dog get good exercise, that can be really beneficial for them. And then the socialization aspect is also very important. But you have to balance that aspect out with how potentially dangerous it is for the dog. So if you're going and there's already 10 dogs in the dog park, I would say turn around and take your dog for a walk around the block instead. When it comes down to it, your cost-benefit ratio here is going to slew out of the way when there are too many dogs, when there are large dogs in the small dog park, or if you know any dogs who are prone to going to the park who have had issues with your dog. So dogs tend to be they're pretty good at remembering who each dog is. So if you have a dog that has had an altercation with your dog or was particularly mean or aggressive towards your dog, then the next time you see them at the dog park, the same thing is probably going to happen, and you want to avoid that. So when I was taking my dogs to the dog park more frequently, I remember there was one dog who, anytime we would go, I would turn around and leave if they were there. The dog, every single time we showed up, would run over and insistently, constantly, without fault, try to hump my dog. Constantly. The entire time. Like, have to pull the dog off of my dog, humping him the whole time. It was insane. Absolutely insane. And you'd see the dog in the park and automatically say, yep, not happening, not today, we're turning around and going back. And that was the case. So if you have any dog who gives your dog issues, learn to recognize them and get out, because the other person is 100% never going to take responsibility for that. Never going to leave if you want to bring your dog in and let your dog play for a while. So best to try at a different time, or just take your dog to a different park, or go to a non-dog park and let your dog go for a walk. So it's best to make sure that you're balancing those costs and those balances. You want to make sure that your dog's having an enjoyable time, because if your dog isn't having an enjoyable time, it's going to cause issues later on down the road. So a lot of people try to throw their dog into socialization, and they don't pair it with reinforcement. So if your dog is enjoying their time playing with other dogs, that's great. they're going to have a great time. But if your dog is a little bit unsure, a little bit fearful, you want to make sure that you're pairing positive things and you're not throwing them into too much at once. A lot of people, when they try to desensitize their dog to new things, they just throw them head first into as much as they possibly can, and they come to me like 6 months later and they say, my dog is a little bit fearful of strangers. They're scared of other dogs, and I don't understand why. I took them out and they met these dogs and these dogs and these people, and the problem is they don't realize that when they're out and they're doing these things, their dog is having these interactions, but they're not having positive interactions. They're not having a good time about it. And if they're not having a good time about it, you need to be very cautious about how much you're throwing them into these situations and how much you're putting them through and the experience they're having. So if your dog is a little fearful of other dogs, instead of going and throwing them into more situations where they're meeting other dogs, you want to make sure that you're pairing that with positive interactions and positive reinforcement. Now, how that ties back into the dog park side of things is you want to make sure that your dog is having a positive interaction when they're going to the park. And if there are huge amounts of people there and dogs there, you're more likely to have them get into some type of altercation and have them have a bad time. And you don't want that to happen. So if you're picking a time when there's less dogs there and you're making sure that they're in an appropriate size, then you're a lot more likely to have success with them. Now, the other big consideration I like to make sure that people make is the health side of things. So with dog parks, when your dog is interacting with more dogs and strange dogs, you're more likely to put them at risk for parasites and for viruses and bacteria and things like that. So things that can be transmitted from dog to dog are a lot more likely to be passed at a dog park or a doggy daycare, things like that. So I always recommend that people talk to their veterinarian and see what their veterinarian recommends for the area. So in certain areas, there might be specific parasites that they're more likely to encounter. There might be certain viral components, things like that they wouldn't normally recommend to the average person, but when you're going to be going to dog parks, they would recommend that you do it. So what can happen is, because you're at a dog park, you're not only having the interactions between the dogs, but if there are parasites involved, if a dog goes to the bathroom at the park, parasites pass through feces, and they can pass through the paw pads on your dog's feet. So if your dog steps in another dog's poop, or if they happen to lick their paws later, that can be a vector for disease. So you want to make sure that your dog is always fully vaccinated first off, and then also consult your veterinarian on what kind of other preventions you need to take for your area based on what they know is going on. And then you also want to make sure that you're also fully protected from fleas and ticks as well, because those can be passed at dog parks too. Now, the other thing you want to consider with dog parks is you want to make sure that you are taking full accountability for your dog's behavior. So if you aren't sure how your dog behaves around other dogs, or your dog is okay with some dogs but seems to dislike other dogs, or has gotten in fights with some other dogs before, you need to take full responsibility for that and acknowledge that you shouldn't be taking your dog to the dog park. Because when it comes down to it, you're putting other people's dogs in danger on top of your own. So you can control a scenario where you're walking your dog and you're letting them interact with one dog at a time, but when there are multiple dogs involved and you're in an area where everyone's off leash, things can become a little bit more hectic, a little faster, and you could be far away from your dog and kind of caught off guard if something happens. So if your dog has issues with other dogs, or they've had a history of getting in fights with some dogs, you want to take the safe side and go ahead and avoid that area. So there are situations where some people will bring kind of mildly aggressive dogs to dog parks, or dogs that have too much intensity and don't do well. You want to make sure that your dog is social and good with other dogs. It doesn't have any history of negative interactions with other dogs if you're going to bring them to the dog park, because you want them to have success. And every time that they have a negative interaction, it's just going to cause potentially more behavioral issues. Now, that's not saying it's 100% going to cause behavioral issues, but it can completely cause your dog to become more aggressive towards other dogs, or more fearful towards other dogs, or fearful of certain scenarios, fearful of people grabbing at your dog if they are associating that with other bad things happening. So you just want to make sure that your dog is has the right personality for going to the dog park in the first place. Don't force your dog to go to the dog park with the expectation of, well, I need to socialize my dog, because it's just not a good fit for some dogs. Your dog can have their socialization in other aspects. We can do a more controlled setting. But if you do have a dog who is social, you are fully vaccinating them, you are making sure that you're taking all the proper precautions, you're not bringing them in when there's too many dogs around, then yeah, if you're in a controlled setting, you have a controlled amount of dogs, and you are supervising everybody and making sure that you're watching your dog and their body language, then you can go ahead and test out the dog park periodically. You don't want to rely on that as your dog's only form of stimulation, because socialization is great. It's amazing for dogs to be able to socialize with one another and play with one another, but you want to make sure that you're doing other forms of mental stimulation as well. So take caution, let your dog enjoy themselves if they enjoy themselves, and don't try to force yourself to bring your dog to the dog park just because people try to tout how wonderful it is, because it can be great for some dogs, it can be terrible for other dogs, and always be careful about it. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.